2 weeks ago, the Ukrainian forces crossed the Ukraine-Russia border in Russia's west, Ukraine's north, in what looks like a pretty significant incursion.
Isabelle Khurshudyan is the Ukraine bureau chief for The Post. She is reporting on a big turn in the war between Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine has advanced its troops into Russia for the first time. Ukrainian soldiers have moved just north of the border, taking control of Russian villages in what's known as the Kursk region.
It's not a short-term raid, as many thought it might be. They've really turned the tables of this war more than 2 years after Russian forces invaded Ukraine and occupied some 20% of the country.
And I understand that some of our colleagues at The Post were able to go with soldiers into the Kursk region of Russia. Can you just describe a little bit your sense of what they were able to see there and what that tells us?
So one of the soldiers that our colleagues talked to who took them across the border, drone commander whose call sign is Boxer.
Я подумав, що це
He said that
не дуже, звісно, чудова ідея, але потім з кожним днем я розумів, що ми творимо історію і що так ми можемо закінчити цю війну.
at the beginning, he wasn't sure if it was a good idea, this incursion into Russia. But as the days progressed, he realized it was a good idea. And they did have an opportunity to end the war with this, that they were doing something historical. And I do think his thoughts there speaks to the larger kind of Ukrainian public that, maybe were doubters at first, but now see that this could be a game changer going forward. And, it's a gamble. Will Russian President Vladimir Putin really trade something for this? Will the Ukrainian forces be able to hold it? I think whether it was a good idea or not, it just depends what the end game is, what the end goal is. And I don't think we've seen it yet. I think this is very much still developing.
From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Martine Powers. It's Thursday, August 22nd. Today, Isabelle explains what this major shift means for the war and what might happen to the people in this newly occupied area of Russia. So you mentioned that it was 2 weeks ago that Ukrainian troops first entered Russia. How did this all start?
It started in secrecy. Nobody saw this coming. The Ukrainians did not tell their Western partners, probably because they didn't want to be talked out of it, and because they were trying to indeed keep it a secret. And, all of a sudden you see reports of U.S.-supplied infantry fighting vehicles, such as the Stryker, and, regular Ukrainian brigades across the border and kind of moving quite quickly. At first, the Ukrainians said absolutely nothing for the first several days, and soldiers were told to keep quiet. But, now this is kind of an operation that has really, I think, shifted the narrative of the war in the sense that Ukraine had been only having bad news on the battlefield for basically a year. And here you have something where Ukraine is succeeding in one area at least, and Ukrainians are excited. It has kind of shifted the tone a little bit, and it has been a morale boost.
But how did that happen? As you say, the news that we were getting here was that Ukrainians were really, frankly, struggling to hold on to the territory that they have now. So how are they successful in, pushing into Russia and taking over new territory?
The Ukrainians took advantage of a weak spot. That border wasn't that secure. And there were largely conscripts, kind of fresh Russian soldiers who were never meant to see battle against Ukrainian forces that were there. And, Ukraine picked a weak spot and was able to kind of plow ahead that way.
And at this point, how far into Russia have these Ukrainian troops reached?
Ukraine has claimed that it's, some 17 to 20 miles into Russia. And Ukrainian forces have blown up 3 bridges in the area. That could strand a lot of Russian forces without logistics of being able to resupply or even, withdraw. So there's an opportunity for Ukraine to extend its gains quite quickly.
Wow. So the obvious question here is why? Why did Ukraine decide to do this? And what is our best understanding now of the military's rationale in deciding to move into Russia?
I think there are several reasons. One of which is the buffer zone that President Volodymyr Zelensky has mentioned.
It is now our primary task in defensive operations overall, to destroy as much Russian war potential as possible and conduct maximum counteroffensive actions.
This is Zelensky's nightly address from several days ago with translation from the Ukrainian government that was posted on their website.
This includes creating a buffer zone on the aggressor's territory, our operation in the Kursk region. Everything that inflicts losses on the Russian army, Russian state, their military-industrial complex, and their economy helps prevent the war from expanding and brings us closer to a just end to this aggression, a just peace for Ukraine.
Ukraine's northern Sumy region has been shelled and bombarded quite frequently. This will push Russian forces away from the border and, give people there some peace.
So he's saying that this is basically like self-defense, that they just need some space to make sure that they're safe from Russians here.
Yes, from Russian shelling that was coming from across the border. Mm-hmm. The other reason, I believe, is obviously leverage in negotiations going forward, especially with U.S. elections coming up and candidate Trump talking about a potential deal between Russia and Ukraine and brokering that. I think Ukraine was on poor footing before this operation and now has something it can trade, some leverage if they were going to enter into negotiations. So I don't expect that will happen anytime soon. But if it were, this does help them in that sense. And then the third reason is because they were losing ground in Ukraine, especially in the eastern Donetsk region around the logistical hub of Pokrovsk. They still continue to lose ground there. And I think they were hoping Russia, to defend this attack on Kursk, would divert forces that it has inside Ukraine and move them north to defend this Ukrainian attack. We've seen that somewhat, but maybe not as much as the Ukrainian military was hoping.
So, Izzy, in terms of what you're describing of what's been happening here, Ukrainian troops have entered into Russia. They've taken over a pretty significant swath of Russian territory. They've taken control of towns there. The Russians who live in those towns are now essentially like under the control of Ukrainian troops. I think a lot of Americans at this point are asking the question of, this sounds kind of like Ukraine invaded Russia. We're not using the word invasion, we're using the word incursion, which is very specific. But I want to understand from you, what is your sense of like the timeline going forward in this? Is this a quick in and out kind of thing, or is this more of a long-term plan for the Ukrainian troops to stay in this part of Russia?
Well, that's the question. I don't know what the point is exactly, what they want to achieve, what they want to get in return exactly. But considering, already the risk of doing something like this, I don't expect them to leave until, they have something very tangible to show for it.
So you mentioned the fact that many of the Russian soldiers who were along the border here were conscripts, soldiers that weren't necessarily prepared for combat. And that's part of what made it so, maybe not so easy, but easier for Ukrainian troops to take over this territory. For all these Russian soldiers who have now been essentially taken prisoners of war by the Ukrainian troops, what has that meant for them? Like, tell me a little bit about what we know of these prisoners of war and what's going on.
Yeah, they're young men, and the Ukrainians definitely want to exchange them. This is already one of the major kind of tangible things that the Ukrainians can claim as a success, which is that they have taken, what's believed to be hundreds of these Russian prisoners of war that they would very, very much like to exchange for their own, Ukrainian prisoners of war who the Russian forces have. But it's also a politically sensitive issue for Putin because, conscripts who are just filling out their, mandatory military service and their mothers are angry. And in the past, it's been mothers of soldiers at war who have caused the most political waves in Russia. So I think Putin would definitely kind of like to see those guys be returned as well.
Mm-hmm. Isabelle, we talked about our colleagues who have been able to go into this part of Russia along with Ukrainian troops to get a sense of what's happening there. And they were actually able to sit down with some of these Russian prisoners of war to talk to them about their experience and their reaction to what has been happening. Though I do want to point out, and I think it's important to be clear, that these interviews that happened with these Russian soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers were there while our colleagues were interviewing them. They were present for these conversations, but our understanding is that they weren't directing these Russian soldiers on what to say. But I'm curious, what are some of the things that stuck out to you about some of what we heard from these Russian soldiers?
Yeah, when our colleagues visited, some guys were, I think, watching Garfield. Those that had wounds seemed like they were being treated. I remember talking to Siobhan O'Grady, our Ukraine correspondent, who said, that they were being treated fairly well, which makes sense because, again, for Ukraine, what Zelensky has called this is an exchange fund. Literally, they're trying to capture as many guys as possible to get as many Ukrainians who are, have been captured by the Russians back.
And then I was also really curious to hear about the experiences of Russian civilians who live in these towns in the Kursk region that Ukrainian forces have now taken over. And they're basically stranded there. Talk to me about what these civilians are going through right now.
What they're going through is uncertainty. Ukraine has offered them to be able to leave to Russia or go into Ukraine. And what they're in right now is kind of a limbo. Ukrainian soldiers, my understanding is they have been passing out some humanitarian aid and things of that sort. But especially when you talk about elderly people or people with disabilities, they don't want to leave their home.
There was one woman in particular who stuck out to me in the voices that our colleagues collected, a woman named Marina who lives in Suja. And she talked about the situation and what she wants to see happen going forward. Let's listen to a little bit of her.
She was basically, asking, make a deal with Putin. Tell Zelensky, make a deal with Putin to end this. We have kids. We want to, live a normal life, go home. She was within tears just saying, we don't want this. So for the civilians in Suja, I don't think they ever expected, Ukrainian forces to come across that border. However, Ukrainians in Sumy, they've been under attack from the Russian side for, over 2 years.
I am curious, has this event and this incursion from the last couple of weeks, has it started to change the way that regular Russians are thinking about this war or making them feel more acutely the cost of this war?
It's really hard to say. I think Russians largely were already pro-war because of kind of Russian state-controlled TV and the propaganda and what they've been told about Ukraine and Ukrainians. This would probably push them even further in that camp because now they feel attacked. But otherwise, it's really hard to get a sense of what Russians believe.
After the break, we hear more about Vladimir Putin and why he's been largely silent about Ukraine's push into Russia. We'll be right back. So tell me, how has Russian President Vladimir Putin responded to what's been going on these last couple of weeks?
Putin has responded by, saying that his negotiation stance is not going to soften because of this. And otherwise, he's been kind of, not front and center on it. My colleague, Robin Dixon, smartly wrote that when crisis like this does happen for Putin, he does tend to freeze up a little bit and respond slowly. I do think some other kind of response is coming, but at the moment, we're not really seeing him take a leading role on this.
Putin did give one televised statement about this on August 12th. This was in an operational meeting with members of his administration, Russian Security Council, law enforcement agency, and heads of the regions. And so let's just listen to a little bit of Putin speaking here.
Так вот, судя по всему, противник стремится к улучшению своих переговорных позиций в будущем.
What is Putin saying here?
Yeah, he's saying that this is clearly a tactic by Ukraine to better its negotiating position. But, Putin is also saying, what kind of negotiations can we have with soldiers who attack civilians and endanger nuclear infrastructure and critical infrastructure? So he's basically kind of pushing away the idea of any negotiations coming out of this.
Mm-hmm. And that gets back to the question of what Ukrainians are hoping to achieve here, and also the risks of carrying out this military attack into this part of Russia. Because, I wonder if this is going to, increase Russian sense of victimhood here, that make more Russians believe, look, they're actually coming across the border into our country, taking over our towns, that, as we've been saying all along, we are the victims here. We are the ones trying to defend themselves. And, people should be on the side of us and not the Ukrainians.
Yeah, I think the Russian victimhood thing was going to be there no matter what. And ultimately, Ukraine doesn't care what Russians think. Mm-hmm. If Russians, feel sorry for themselves or not. The important thing is that I think what Ukraine is trying to show is all of those things that Putin just talked about, attacking civilians, endangering nuclear infrastructure, endangering critical infrastructure such as energy. Russia's been doing that to Ukraine for 2.5 years. So, I think the Ukrainians, for them, it's important that they have the support of their Western partners. And to this point, it looks like that is still indeed the case.
Yeah, that was my next question. What does the U.S. government have to say about all this? And the fact that the Ukrainians didn't tell them that they were going to be doing this?
Yeah, I think that, the public stance of the U.S. government so far has been Ukraine is defending itself. We have, told them to do that, especially with border areas such as the Sumy region and the Kharkiv region. And, it's Ukraine's call where to launch operations. I think everybody was certainly surprised, but, they kind of have to support it.
But what happens if Ukraine continues taking more land in Russia? And is there a world in which this causes this war to escalate?
The Ukrainian opinion on that is that this war has always been escalated. There's not very many places you can go from here. So, I don't think the Ukrainians are worried about escalation, and the West was always worried about it. But slowly, everything that the West said would escalate hasn't. Ukraine has struck deep into Russian territory with drones. At some point, there was fears that F-16s would escalate, and now they're in Ukraine, or certain other types of weapon systems. Or allowing Western weapons to strike on the territory of Russia. all of these boundaries have steadily been taken down, and we haven't seen the kind of major escalation.
So what happens now? What is the prospect that Russian troops will be able to push Ukrainian troops out of this region of Russia in the short term and be able to regain this territory?
Well, it's really hard to, free up territory, to push forces out, especially if the Ukrainians are able to build fortified defenses and things of that sort. It would require a lot of Russian troops, a lot of manpower, which would potentially stretch them in other places along the front line. So, I think they might be able to kind of stop the Ukrainian advance, but actually getting the Ukrainians out of there is going to be quite difficult anytime in the near future.
And as you pointed out, Izzy, this doesn't mean that Ukraine is totally winning the war here, right? There are other Ukrainian territories that are still under threat by Russia or where Russian troops are advancing. And to me, it just paints a very strange picture of what this war is looking like, that it's really dynamic, that both Russians and Ukrainians are on the offensive in different places at the same time. What do you think that says about the state of this war right now?
It is true that in the eastern Ukrainian area, Russian forces are making advances, and Ukraine has arguably put itself in a more vulnerable position there by putting all of its reserves, or much of its reserves, into Western Russia. I think eventually Russia will have to divert troops from there or from some other part of the Ukrainian front line to try to counterattack, and Ukraine will be able to take advantage. I think that is part of the thought process. I think what they're trying to do is trying to change the momentum in a different way, that they might be able to use this to trade back for territory somewhere else, essentially.
So when you look at the events of the last 2 weeks, do you think that this has brought Ukraine and Russia closer to the end of this war or further away from the end of this war?
It's so hard to say because I feel like negotiations are further away because Russia is now embarrassed. And I do think it's unlikely Putin will negotiate after, being kind of attacked like this. However, I do think Ukraine has bettered its position for the long run. I think it's just too soon to tell where this is all going and how it's going to end.
Isabelle, thank you so much for explaining all this.
Thank you.
Isabelle Khurshudyan is the Ukraine bureau chief for The Post. Before you go, a few other stories I'd like to share with you today. First, an update on a Post Reports episode that you might remember from this spring. It was reported by The Post's Jessica Contrera and Jen Abelson, and it was about a teen who was sexually assaulted by a police officer in New Orleans. The Post doesn't identify victims of sexual assault without their consent. With her permission, The Post is using her middle name, Nicole. Nicole was 14 when she first met the police officer, Rodney Vicnair, in 2020. He was dispatched to her house to drive her to the hospital for a rape examination.
All right, I'm Officer Vicnair, this is Officer Carroll, this is Officer Corkum. I'm not going to ask you a bunch of questions. I'm not even going to ask you more than 2 questions, all right, because that's between you, your mom, and the detectives.
Vicnair offered to be Nicole's friend and mentor, but then spent months grooming and abusing her. Nicole is 19 now. This is what she told Post Reports about her standing up against Vicnair and the agency he worked for, the New Orleans Police Department.
1,000%. I believe that they are responsible for it. Both the NOPD and Rodney need to be held accountable.
Last year, Vicnair pleaded guilty to the assault. Then he died in prison. But Nicole continued a civil rights lawsuit against the city of New Orleans. On Wednesday, a federal jury ordered the city to pay $1 million to Nicole. The jurors found that the city failed to properly vet Vicnair. This story was part of a wider investigation into hundreds of law enforcement officers charged with crimes involving child sexual abuse. Next, on the campaign front, there could be a big change for Robert F. Kennedy Jr. The independent presidential candidate said he will announce on Friday whether he will exit the race and if he'll endorse former President Donald Trump. On Wednesday night, Tim Walz accepted the nomination for vice president at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago.
Look, we got 76 days. That's nothing. There'll be time to sleep when you're dead. We're going to leave it on the field.
Tonight, presidential candidate Kamala Harris is expected to speak. She will mark the grand finale of one of the biggest weeks for the Democratic Party this year. For more campaign news on up to November, listen to The Campaign Moment. Find it wherever you stream podcasts. That's it for Post Reports. Thanks for listening. Today's show was produced by Bishop Sand, with help from Rennie Svirnovsky, Ali Bianco, and Emma Talkoff. It was mixed by Sean Carter and edited by Monica Campbell, with help from Rena Flores. Thanks to Jen Amer, John Gerberg, and Siobhan O'Grady. I'm Martine Powers. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from the Washington Post.